Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is HawkCast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast, brought to you by Hawkeye Beacon and Rivals.com. I'm your lead analyst and host, Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on X. I got that changed. We're moving forward, folks. Joined by Ross Binder here on this Monday morning, post-selection Sunday. So a lot to talk about here today on the podcast. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribe here on YouTube, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Leave those rates and reviews. Drop a like, drop a comment. Let us know how you're feeling about the women's draw playing Murray State in the first round in Norman, Oklahoma. Lots of other stuff happening. Omar Young hired as Iowa's running backs coach, and two players in the portal already for the men, Brock Harding, Owen Freeman. We'll start with that, but before we do that, make sure as well, I promise this is our last reminder here, that you sign up for our limited time 50% off first year subscriptions. Iowa MBB is the promo code at iowa.rivals.com to get all of our premium content. We're getting an update today on the coaching search. We've got breakdowns of potential candidates for Iowa men's basketball. Um, Women's tournament coming up, spring ball on the way. Lots happening right now for Iowa sports. So, again, now we'll get to it. Brock Harding enters the portal this morning for the men's basketball team. Owen Freeman entered a couple days ago. This is, what did you say, Ross, when I said it to you this morning? Saw that one coming. And that's just kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, especially, with Freeman entering the portal the other day, and it's not to say that they're a package deal for wherever, if they end up going somewhere else. I don't think that's the case at all, but I think they are very closely tied together. They both obviously played high school ball together, came to Iowa together, have been very close, are very close. And it's also just not surprising, even without that, on the level of we're going to see a lot of guys from this team enter the portal after this season and after Fran being let go. Like that's just inevitable. So I wasn't surprised to see Harding enter the portal. I won't be surprised to see some other guys on the team enter the portal in the next few days or whatever that looks like. So yeah, it definitely did not come as a surprise. I think we've been kind of primed for this. It's for sure since Fran, we got that resolution on his future last week. But I think there was some indications that we're going to be some guys in the portal no matter what. So we will definitely be following that pretty closely for the next few weeks.
And it's going to be kind of a quasi football portal situation where there's going to be guys out, there's going to be guys in, and more so than what we're probably used to for basketball at this rate. Of course, men's basketball has had guys portal out, had guys portal in. Desante Bowen last season, as well as Drew Thelwell and Seydou Traore coming in. But just due to the staff turning over, it's going to be some hefty turnover on the roster too.
I mean, the norm in the portal era when coaches leave and new coaches come in has been really, really heavy roster turnover. I mean, we saw Iowa played a few teams this year that had brand new coaches, and they had, if not entirely new rosters, like very strong majority new rosters. Like there's not a lot of staying put. When the coach leaves, you leave, and that's the way things are right now. So it's yeah, that's just kind of what we're I think primed for the most part.
Regarding the roster going into next season, the likelihood that it's what you just said, the likelihood that there's anybody around. I think it's also dependent on who they hire. Like Price Sanford was teammates with Tucker DeVries, right?
Yep.
Of course, there's a ton of smoke around Darren right now. Um, and West Virginia is not playing in the NCAA tournament. They're not playing in the NIT, and they're not playing in the Crown. So smoke. Um,
Yeah.
and so Price would make some sense. Price was recruited by Darren at Drake, and went on an official to Drake while there too. So that
Yep.
would make some sense. If it's McCollum, that's a completely different way of playing basketball. So I would be surprised if some of those guys stick around at the same time. Something that I outlined in our coaching candidate breakdown, which again, that's for our premium subscribers. If you want to check that out, 50% off your first year right now. So his two tallest players on the Drake roster are 6'8" and 6'7". You can get away with that
Yeah,
at Drake. Ooh, I don't know about that at
I
Iowa.
I would
So
not try to do that in the Big Ten.
maybe he looks at the roster and says, "Hey, Logi, want to stick around?" Or for example,
Yep.
or maybe he sees Riley Mulvey, who's 7 feet tall, and says, "Hey, you got one more year. We can try it." Or just throwing stuff out there. He didn't do much in the portal by way of D1. Like they didn't have a single high major transfer on that roster. They had a couple guys from Wyoming, but that's mid-major. Other than that, four guys from Northwest Missouri State. I think he had a couple young guys, young recruits, but yeah. So roster construction will definitely be dependent on the coach and who they decide to bring in. Um, but yeah, I don't know that we need to talk about that too much more. For right now, there's going to be so many other things to talk about with men's basketball as the offseason progresses. Um, but yeah, dive into the women.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. NCAA tournament selection show yesterday. They waited until the last possible moment to say where Iowa was going.
The
We were
very last regional that they unveiled.
we were in the Feller room, and that's where they have events like this. They invited media, and every six seed, when Iowa didn't get picked, you could hear, "Oh." Every five, six, seven seed around
Yep.
there is like, "Oh."
Yep.
But then finally happens. Jada Jimfy, or was please somewhere warm. I could hear her saying that right when the Notre Dame area or regional or whatever was getting selected. I could
Yep.
feel that there was tense in the air. But Norman, Oklahoma, it is, as they'll be playing Murray State in the first round, and then potentially Oklahoma in that second round, as Oklahoma is the host.
Yep.
But they will take on Murray State on Saturday at 11 a.m., the Missouri Valley Conference Tournament champions. I don't know particularly a ton about Murray State. I don't think a lot of people do, but did a little deep dive last night on their roster and what they bring to the table. So we'll just go into that a little bit. But this is their first time in the NCAA tournament since 2007, 2008. I think they've been through three or four coaches, if I remember right, in that time frame. And this is their first time in the MVC too. Remember, Murray State just joined the MVC 3 years ago, 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah, when they were announced last night as in the tournament and Iowa's opponent, and they said they were the Missouri Valley champions, I kind of did a little head turn. I was like, oh yeah, I guess they are in
Yeah,
the MVC now because I remember I think they were in the Ohio Valley
they were. They
Conference
were in the OVC.
for years and years and years, and obviously, conference realignment is shaking up everything at all levels. So yeah, they found their way from the Ohio Valley to the Missouri Valley now. And yeah, had a really good year. They split the regular season title with Missouri State. And then they won the conference tournament with 3 games and swept the 3 games they had to play and really only tested in one game. Drake in the semifinals gave them a really tight game. It was like 95-90, I think.
96, 90, yeah.
96-90. But they won
Dinnebeer, I
the
think Dinnebeer had like 40.
she went off. Yeah, she
She's
was
so
because
good.
she's a phenomenal player. And yeah, I mean Drake was I think the Valley was a one bid league, right? So like
Think so. It
yeah,
wouldn't have
so
been
like
Drake anyway. Drake
right.
fell in the second
Drake
round, so
right, Drake needed to win the tournament to get in. So she was doing everything she could to help in that effort. Didn't quite, obviously came up short. But Murray State won their other two turning games by double digits pretty comfortably. And yeah, they were obviously a really good team in the Valley this year. And interesting, they were the highest scoring team in women's college basketball this year. Averaged I think 87.9 points a game. So yeah,
I didn't know they were the highest. I went through their numbers.
yeah,
They scored 100 plus 6 times,
yep.
90 plus 14 times.
Yeah, this is not a team that's afraid to push it. They like to score, and they like to score a lot. So it'll be interesting because Iowa's been obviously Iowa likes to push the tempo as well, but this particular Iowa team has been a little more defensive focused and really tried to lock down on that end of the court. So I think Murray State, I mean, they'll be a good test for this Iowa team. It's they're an 11 seed, but they're a really solid 11, it looks like.
I'm sure we'll learn more about them
Yeah.
as we get closer and we talk to the players before the game in Norman. But 11 seed is actually pretty high for the Missouri Valley for the most part, especially in the women's tournament. Usually they're probably about 13, 14, 15. Maybe not 15, but like 13, 14
Yep.
is typically where they land. The MVC, I mean, they've had some pretty solid teams this year. I mean, we saw UNI beat Iowa State. Drake, obviously, Dennebier was a stud this season.
Yep.
But they played some solid teams in the non-con too. Played and lost to LSU and Alabama. Um, also had I think four losses in the MVC, which is pretty common. I mean, that's where all of the Drake men, that's where all their three losses came from was conference play. That's just the Valley for you. But like you said, slaughtered Bradley and Belmont. They played Belmont in the conference championship game and I think beat them by 30.
Mm.
So this is what we're talking about. This is a high octane offense. Um,
Yep.
I don't know if it goes the way that it can go, it's not an automatic victory for Iowa. Like the way that they score the basketball, but they're also playing against bigger, better athletes. I mean, this is what we're talking about in every first round matchup, more or
Yep.
less. So, um, I don't think it's a gimme. I mean,
Mm.
yeah, yeah, you don't either.
No, I don't. Definitely not. I mean, I think you have to have a lot of respect for Murray State and what they did this year. Like you said, 11 is a little bit better seed than normal for a Valley team, which suggests to me like this is not your average Valley champion. This is, a little bit better than what a lot of those Valley champion teams are. So they're going to be a really good test. And if they're hitting shots, obviously the way they're capable of hitting shots, then I was going to have to be prepared to try and match them in terms of that scoring. And they definitely had times this year when they could do that, but we've seen some times too when this offense gets, hit some snags, hit some potholes, and goes quiet for a while. And probably don't want to do that against a team averaging almost 90 a game, unless you're able to slow them down a lot too, obviously. So yeah, it looks like a really good test. You mentioned or they've got several players averaging double figures, which you would expect for a team scoring almost 90 a game. Got to come from somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah. Caitlin Young is their leading scorer, grad student, averaging 22.2 points per game. Second leading scorer is Haley, I think it's Pook, 17.1 as a sophomore. She's a Waterloo West grad. So
Yep.
Iowa might have to go through two Waterloo West grads in the first two rounds between Pook and I think it's Sahara Williams that's on the Oklahoma staff or on the Oklahoma roster. Let me pull that up. I want to make sure I get that right. But she was a hooper for West, and I remember folks being disappointed that she was going to Oklahoma as opposed to staying in state. But yeah, Sahara Williams. Um, she is a 5'11 guard from Waterloo, excuse me, forward from Waterloo. All Big 12 honorable mention this year. So having a good season, but of course we'll talk a little bit more about Oklahoma as we get closer. But it's an interesting draw for a lot of reasons. I mean, the potential to play Jenny Baranchik's team, who some people, you know, called the heir apparent to Lisa Bluter before
Yeah,
Jane Jensen was hired.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she was definitely one of the candidates that people had discussed as a legitimate replacement for Bluter often. She was a star player at Iowa in the early 2000s, got into coaching and was really good at Drake. Was there for a few years, and then she parlayed that into the Oklahoma job where she is currently, and obviously had a really nice year there this year. So, and yeah, she was someone that got talked about as a real strong replacement option for Bluter when Bluter decided to step down. Obviously, Iowa decided to go in-house and promote Jan Jensen instead. But yeah, there'll definitely be some storylines to that game should Iowa and Oklahoma both get to the second round. Oklahoma has to get by Florida Gulf Coast in the first round, but
Eh,
obviously they'll be pretty heavy favorites in that one
yeah,
as the
playing
three seed and the host team. So,
playing at home. Yeah, like you
right.
said. Um, I've never been to Oklahoma before, so I'm excited for that for myself. Also,
Hmm.
I may have mentioned this before. So before Cooper DeJean at OABCIG High School, there was Trevor Ryan. Trevor was 2 years older than me, ended up playing football at Iowa State, had a great career there, went from a walk-on to he was one of those who's the Paul Horning Award uh
Mm,
potential. He was like one of the nominees before the year or like on the watch list.
okay.
Had a couple punt returns for touchdowns, had a big touchdown against Oklahoma when Iowa State upset them when Kyle Kempt was playing quarterback. Um, this may be all over Iowa fans' heads because this is Iowa State niche stuff, and I only know it because Trevor was like my mentor when I was a sophomore, if you will, one of my better friends, and now he's on the strength staff at Iowa State. So all that to say, he has told me Oklahoma is one of the prettiest campuses he's ever been on. So
Well, there you go.
could be interesting.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd say about Iowa is I'm interested to see how kind of being an underdog, and how, works for them in this first round or that they won't be an underdog in the first round, but in these, traveling to somebody else's court for these opening weekend games, obviously under Caitlin Clark the last 3 years, they were I think 1 or 2 seed every single season, obviously hosting. And they had tremendous, incredible home atmospheres for those games. There was also a ton of pressure because you're heavily favored. You got to win those games. They had big aspirations to, and obviously, they fulfilled those. Went on to the national title game the last 2 years, but some of the hardest games they had in those tournament runs were especially those second round games. Last year against West Virginia was an absolute just battle to get out of to escape that game and get into the Sweet 16. 2 years before that, they lost to Creighton, I believe, in that second round game in Iowa City. So, and this year that pressure will be on Oklahoma. They're the host team, they're the 3 seed. They're the team expected to get through to the Sweet 16 from this little pod, not Iowa. So Iowa gets to play a little bit freer, maybe. They don't have just that weight of expectation, that weight of, oh, you got to get through, you got to do this, and everything. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out this weekend. Although obviously they got to get through Murray State first. That is the priority on Saturday for sure.
I am curious about this too, and I'm going to have an article on this today, is how they approach this having had 2 weeks off. I think that's really interesting because it's not just traveling somewhere else. It's having to not sit on your hands, but sit around and wait, hurry up and wait for 2 weeks, get prepped, work on things but not know who you're playing in the middle of the season. I asked Lucy Olson about it yesterday, and she was like, "It's kind of like the preseason, where you're
Yeah.
just focusing on yourself for 2 weeks." So I
Yeah.
think that's a really interesting storyline to follow. Of course, prior to taking on the Racers, and obviously, like you said, going on the road, like this is different. They haven't done this. When was the last time they did this?
They did it in 21, but that was also like the COVID tournament. So everybody, I think, was down in San Antonio. I think the whole thing was hosted down there. Um, and for testing and all that stuff. So they just used a bunch of different sites around the area. So yeah, there was no hosting then, and they were a 5 seed that year, so they wouldn't have hosted anyway. But I think you have to go back to like 2018, maybe, like for the first like traditional NCAA tournament where they were not at least a top 4 seed in a host school. So yeah, it's been a long time. I mean, Jan Jensen has experience as an assistant coach with what this is like, but obviously her first time as a head coach, the players certainly have no experience with what this will be like. So yeah, it's just going to be a new experience for all those players and a lot of the staff. So should be interesting to see how they handle it all.
I think it'd be easier. Like, of course. trying to think about this. They've been traveling all season, right? So it's not necessarily like, oh, thank God they're not going to Spokane, right?
Yeah.
Which they would be if they go to the Sweet 16. So,
Yeah.
I don't think that is going to be much of a factor. I think it's the only things that I think about are being on the road for these first two rounds, and then that 2 weeks off. I'm really, really interested. Like that
Lu-
I'm gonna go back through quotes and stuff for this story that I'm gonna write today.
Yeah.
I just find that really interesting.
Someone asked Lucy at the availability yesterday, that Iowa actually played better on the road in the second half of the season. And she kind of laughed and I don't think thought it was a huge deal, and it's not, but they did really play a little bit better on the road this year than in the second half of the season than at home. Although there were some great home performances as well. Obviously, the big one being that win over USC was a phenomenal effort at home. But this was not a team that was shaken by being on the road. They won in several road games and played very well on the road, like that game in Ann Arbor against Michigan, game against at Nebraska. So there were definitely some times on the road when they were playing really well, and hopefully that gives them some confidence and something they can tap into this weekend.
Additionally, before we move on, in the region that Iowa's in, they've got UConn, Oklahoma, Kentucky, USC. Whew, that
Yeah,
is,
likely. Yeah, almost certainly will get UConn should they manage to get out of into the Sweet 16. So,
and Kansas State's in that region, who has given them fits before, beat them
right.
with Caitlin on the roster last season. So it's gonna be fun.
Yeah. If they manage to get past this second weekend or this first weekend into the second weekend, there would be storylines aplenty with, whoever they play. UConn, obviously USC, they played this year, had a great game. K-State, a lot of recent history there. So yeah, lots of potential intrigue for sure, but uh, focused on Murray State and then most likely Oklahoma first.
Honestly, like I saw a few people say, "Oh, they got a tough draw," and but I don't know that there is a easy draw. Like it's the NCAA tournament. The one that I think looks to be the easiest would be South Carolina's region. You've got Duke as the 2 seed, UNC as the 3 seed, then Maryland's the 4. But I also one thing, a story from yesterday as well, is in whatever region it was. Oh, it was in the Texas region where Ohio State's hosting in the first two rounds. I was talking to my buddy Ethan Petrick. He covers or he works for the Quad City Times, and we both said right before they announced the 5 seed as Tennessee in that area in the Columbus region. Um, or right after, rather, Ethan goes, "Oh, I could feel Iowa was going to be the 5 seed. I could feel it in my bones." They were going to set up Iowa to play Ohio State in the second round. Like, of course they would do that, but they didn't. So that would have been interesting. That would have been a storyline too.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact rules are in terms of,
I don't know either.
avoiding conference rematches. Obviously, in the first round, they're not gonna do any rematches. But I don't know when kind of those protections kind of fade away because you can't. At some point, they're just gonna happen. In the past, I think they try to avoid it in the second round too. It's got to be so much harder now, with these monstrously big conferences sending, just tons of teams. Like it's almost impossible to keep them apart. So
Right. Like the elimination of the Pac-12 just does not help the situation either. Because like you could play Cal and NC State in the first round and it'd be like, oh, they never see each other. But now the
yeah,
ACC is on both coasts. How does that make any freaking sense?
and well, that just reminds me. I think it was the men's bracket, and it was if they both win, it would be like Arizona versus Oregon. I saw, and I was like, oh, that's a Pac-12 game. It's like, no, that's Big 12 versus Big 10 now, Ross. Duh.
Right. Yeah.
It's like this is weird, and it's going to take some getting used to still. So
It is. Um All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Iowa football hiring of Omar Young, because we haven't talked about that at all to this point, because of the Fran McCaffrey situation as well as the NCAA tournament. Before we do that, gotta tell you, we had the top three candidates on our board before it was announced that Omar Young was the candidate, was selected. First reported, I can't confirm, but first reported by Chad Leistikow, the Des Moines Register. Omar Young was one of those three final candidates. And of course, we had him, we shared that list with our premium subscribers. So if you want to be part of that type of thing, privy to that information before that stuff comes out, you can debate with other premium subscribers. We were talking about who is the best fit, why, all that stuff. It was really fun and really interesting to be able to share that with the folks on our board. So do that today. Promo code Iowa MBB at checkout. Also, we've got the autofill sign up link. It's the first thing in the description down there. Super quick and easy. Just click it. It'll fill it out for you. So do that today. We're gonna keep pushing it because it's 50% off your entire first year to get all of our premium content. So join us today. Don't miss out on that deal because you're gonna be regretting it come spring ball, especially. We're gonna have a ton of content on football and spring ball. So Omar Young hired as Iowa's running backs coach. This is something that, or this is a name rather, that I didn't know about going into like when it first started. Everybody said Albert Young, right? Because everybody
Yeah.
thinks Iowa connections, and that makes sense. And I mean, one of those final candidates was Jason Manson, who we referenced before the search started, and who we confirmed was part of that search process, who was already on staff director of development at Iowa, which would have made a lot of sense too, former receiver slash quarterback. And so this one kind of just came out of nowhere. No Iowa ties. I mean, NFL, which makes sense because that's how Kirk likes to go. But I guess were you surprised by this being the guy?
Absolutely. Yeah, Omar Young had not popped up on our radar at all, I think, until, you had that update with kind of those three names, and he was one of them. And then I think we all kind of dove into finding out some more about him. And it did come as a surprise, but it reminds me of the Tim Lester hire a year ago at offensive coordinator, because that was another name that was not on our radar at the start of that process. It was not a guy that we were thinking of. And then, he obviously emerged, and he then became the guy. And that's kind of a similar process with Young, it feels like. They found him and zeroed in on him, and then decided he'd be a good fit. And yeah, I definitely not what we had expected at all. But, I think we're looking at it from an outside perspective, and we start where we start, and we tend to start with those connections to Iowa, because that at least gives us some foothold to at least discuss and speculate, and they often are connections with someone who gets hired. We saw that with Liddell Betts, who Omar Young is replacing. We saw that with Abdul Hajj. Like, Ferentz has not been afraid to use former players, and bring them on as coaches. So it does make sense to start there. But then, especially when they keep it as buttoned up as they have in these recent searches, they can often, they go off and kind of start looking for their guys. And until that information starts coming out, and sometimes it doesn't come out for a little bit, as we found this time, like, we really don't know where they're going or who they're looking at. And so yeah, it's just an interesting process that we've seen the last couple of years with the football coaching hires.
What does make sense is the NFL experience, like I mentioned. He's played, but it's also been with a variety of teams. Kirk
Hmm.
tends to like consistency, if I
This
do
guy
say
doesn't have
so
to,
myself.
this guy doesn't have a lot of that.
No, been around the league quite a bit. Spent this last season with the New England Patriots. Prior to that, the Bears. He was with the Packers, the Browns. Been all over the place, whether it's in the NFL or college as well. Coached at Eastern Illinois as their running backs coach, so he has experience coaching running backs. Um, Coach, if we have any UNI slash Iowa fans, I included this in the free article that I wrote about Young. He coached Harrison Bay Bowie, and maybe some folks from the Quad Cities will recognize that name too. Harrison Bay Bowie from Bettendorf was their leading rusher when he was a freshman. and then transferred to UNI after that. He's been part of the running game, maybe not consistently, but off and on since. He's entering his senior year, and he's going to stick around with Stepsis. So, um, that's just kind of an interesting nugget, a connection to another program in the state. But he's originally from Oakland, California, and generally where guys are from is at least partially where they recruit.
Hmm.
It's going to be interesting to see where his recruiting locale is, or if they, you know, send him down to an area that they're familiar with, and then make a guy like for example, let's say Abdul Hodge, because he does recruit Florida a little bit. Now that Liddell Betts is gone, maybe
Yep.
Hodge takes over down there fully.
Yep.
They probably have somebody else help out because Florida's just so much talent down there.
Yep.
And Omar Young takes over the St. Louis area because that's where Hodge was really focused prior to, or has been focused anyway. Maybe it's something like that, but he just hasn't been in recruiting in a while. So
I
that'll
think,
be interesting.
yeah, as I say, I think that's the biggest question mark of this hire is, how does he fit into the recruiting? How fast does he kind of get up to speed with that? And,
Is he a
you
good
know,
recruiter? Like,
is he a good recruiter? What kind of relationships is he able to make? How fast can he make them, et cetera? Because that is, Betts was a phenomenal, running back coach just in terms of in the room, what he did with Caleb Johnson and LaShawn Williams and Jazz Patterson, all those guys. Like obviously, the product on the field that he helped with was phenomenal, but he was a really, really strong recruiter as well. So that's something Iowa lost with him, going to the pros. And, I think that's the biggest question mark for how well Young is able to replace Betts as a recruiter because, you mentioned it, he's been a pro guy for the most part for the last several years. No recruiting there. And when he was a college coach, like it was at Eastern Illinois, which is apples and oranges to recruiting at Iowa and the Big Ten. So
I mean, it's apples and oranges to UNI. Like,
yeah,
the Eastern Illinois, to be frank, a dog shit FCS program. They're terrible. So,
yeah,
but Harrison Bay Bowie, for example, was a bright spot, and he came from
mhm.
Iowa. So maybe Omar Young is just like, this is where I am. This is where I'm going to dive in. I'm going to find some talent. Who knows? We'll see. That'll be an interesting introduction to him and how he's going to approach that. But also didn't play running back, which to some people's like red flag, but I mean, but he's coached running backs before, coached them to some success. Jalen Benefield was an All-American, a freshman All-American before Harrison Bay Bowie, ended up transferring to Southern Illinois, kind of struggled after that, but Young's had some success with coaching running backs and been around the NFL, and clearly Kirk likes him for a reason. So um, it'll
I
be
mean, Abdul Hodge coaches tight ends at Iowa.
right,
He
right,
did not
but
he did not play one snap of tight end ever in his college or pro career. So like
right.
that's not a deal breaker.
Right. Seth Wallace never played linebacker either. He played wide
Right.
receiver at Co. So
Right.
it's different at Iowa. Um, but to some people, it's like, oh my God, freak out. Which okay, but
Yeah.
anyway, an interesting hire. I'm intrigued to see how that shakes out and how he follows up with Liddell Betts and how he manages the room that has a ton of talent this spring. That was one of
Mm.
my three thoughts when Liddell Betts announced that he was going to move on. Is how does the next guy keep this room together? Because that's a lot. I mean, they don't have Caleb Johnson anymore. They don't have LeSean Williams, but they still have Jazz Patterson. They still have Kamari Moulton. They still have TJ Washington. They still have Brevin Dahl. They still have Xavier Williams. Like, those are all guys that could get snaps next season.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, so I'm glad they got that hire in place. So they'll have him around for spring ball so he can start working with those guys, building relationships, because that's going to be really important to figure out, what the rotation looks like this fall. And, it was remarkable that Liddell was able to keep all those guys happy and willing to stay.
Never
So
enough carries to go around.
never ever enough carries, exactly. So yeah, we'll see how that works. And yeah, I'm really interested to see what his recruiting territory is going to be at Iowa because, like you said, Liddell was did a lot of work in Florida and was very good down there. Young is originally from California. That's not an area Iowa has tended to prioritize at all in recruiting under Ferentz. They've gotten a few guys out of California for sure, but it's not one of their main recruiting targets, or it hasn't been. I don't know. I don't think it'll change with his hire, but I guess we'll see. But yeah, just how that all that recruiting stuff shakes out is going to be really interesting to watch this year.
Right, like a couple quarterbacks. I mean, Cash Herrera in the 26 class is from La Jolla. Same thing. I
Qu
mean,
Quarterbacks are so weird because like you're trying to find a quarterback. So you cast like they
yeah.
cast such a wide net for quarterbacks, and everybody does. Like you're looking everywhere to find the quarterback that you think can be the guy. So, but yeah, you're right. Like Cash and Spencer Petras, I believe, was a former Cali quarterback,
And Jackson Stratton,
and Jackson Stratton.
the goat of walk-ons. Um, yeah, I'm intrigued. And I mean, they've clearly had some success with Florida running backs. I remember talking to a kid who ended up going to Miami, so very different. But he told me Coach Betts always talks about Florida running backs. So I don't know if that's a trend that's going to continue. I mean, Kamari Moulton, as well as Jazz Patterson, and those are two very different recruits. Jazz Patterson had offers from Oregon, Penn State, like some of the top programs in the country, whereas Kamari Moulton was previously committed to Florida Atlantic. So it's just an interesting dynamic there in the running back room.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, one thing that'll help is if I was able to maintain the success in the running game, that they had with Caleb Johnson this last year. Like nothing gets people excited more than seeing dudes ball out and, go off to the NFL. So, if they're able to, maintain a high level of success in the running game, I think that will definitely help keep those Florida running backs interested in Iowa, even without Liddell in the running back room.
And to boot, Liddell was good at starting those relationships with like defensive backs in
Hmm.
Florida or other position groups or like wide receiver like Jerry at Bowie. Started that relationship, started the relationship with Rashad Godfrey, started the relationship with another guy at Armwood that they're currently recruiting, Demonte Timms, who I think would be a great get. I'm imagining it was the same with Alante Dean, who they brought in as an early enrollee, so from Armwood. So it's just going to be interesting to see how Omar follows up. But again, folks, tons of premium content right now. Only more to come. Men's basketball coaching search going on right now. That's why we have that 50% off your entire first year happening right now at Hawkeye Beacon. We're going to be loaded with content regarding that, especially this week. NCAA tournament coming up for the women, followed by spring ball for the men. Right now is the time to sign up. 50% off, completely half off. Do not miss it. Tons of content coming that you're gonna want. You don't want to miss out on this. So we will wrap it up here. We appreciate you tuning in to this episode of HawkCast. And also, before I finish up here, that link right down there in the description, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, click it, autofill, really quick and easy, get you signed up, get you that content you're not going to get anywhere else. So do that today. Again, appreciate you tuning into this episode of Hawkcast with us here on from Hawkeye Beacon. And if you're not a premium subscriber yet, do that today. If you're not a subscriber on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, do that. Drop a like, drop a comment on YouTube. Let us know what you're thinking about the hire of Omar Young, how the women do in the NCAA tournament, and what you're thinking about who should be the next hire for the men, all that good stuff. So you can do that. Helps us out a lot. We do definitely appreciate it. Once again, folks, I am Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on X, joined by Ross Binder here on this Monday morning. For now, we will see you next time.